Welcome back, everybody, for our next discussion, which I have the privilege of moderating. This is going to be a bit of a shorter conversation. There will not be any papers. But with me today, as we talk about probably our second favorite topic in New York outside of the weather, transportation, is Tom Wright, here to my left, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Regional Plan Association, RPA, the nation's oldest independent metropolitan research, planning, and advocacy organization. RPA works on improving the quality of life by preparing long-range plans and advocating for their implementation. Joining us remotely today, we're very happy and lucky to have Christopher Coase, who serves as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Transportation. Mr. Coase has spent a career in transportation policy, including serving as a senior leader at Smart Growth America, senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and a professor at George Washington University. Welcome, Christopher. It's good to see you. Let's see if we can, I think you were on mute at that point, but let's try that again. Good morning. Good afternoon, rather. All right, we're still having some audio troubles, but why don't we get started? I guess I'll direct my first question to Tom until we can make sure that Chris can be heard. And this is really a question for both of you. And we, as part of today's discussion, certainly transportation and transportation infrastructure came up a lot. So this is a broad question to both of you. As we look at the city's economic future, what role will transportation play, and why is it important?
So I'll start until Chris until the audio gets cleared up. I mean, I'd say I think the obvious answer is that New York City doesn't exist without its extraordinary transportation network. It is the way the city, the economy of the city functions to have access to the diverse and talented workforce across all of the industries, which really makes New York what it is. And it is, Mark Morial was talking in the last panel about how unique New York is. And it truly is, especially from a transportation perspective. We have millions of subway riders and bus riders every single day, hundreds of thousands of commuter rail riders. There's been a lot of focus during COVID. Of course, we had to kind of practically shut down the entire system for safety. And now it's coming back, and there's a lot of focus on how it's going to come back and the speed and the characteristics of that. But still, New York is not New York without its incredible transportation network and the alternatives to driving that we have here. And so that's just going to be fundamental to our success going forward.
Thank you, Tom. Chris, maybe you can take a broader view in terms of the nation's economy, but certainly would love your thoughts on this question.
Thank you, Jack, and hopefully, is the sound working?
Perfect.
Perfect. Well, if you give me 1 minute of personal privilege, first, it's great to be back with my colleagues in New York. Sorry, I could not be there with you in person. Competing meetings kept me away, but as an adopted son of New York City, graduate of St. John's University out in Queens, and I would like to say I'm always excited to share the stage with Tom and RPA, who in my previous role at Spark for America, we've done a lot of work together, particularly in the releasing of the 2017 Wake Up, Walk Up, and which is really quintessential to this conversation. Transportation drives development, but if we're really honest with ourselves, transportation is by far one of the major attributes that's really setting communities, cities, and countries apart, whether it's economically, whether it's from a public health, whether it's from equity, and particularly as it pertains to how we meet our climate challenge. And so from a national and in many ways a global perspective, how nations, how countries and cities and the neighborhoods use, leverage, and understand the role that transportation plays in their economic, social, and public health will be the hallmark of a successful and vibrant community and country. As such, we are really excited because we have been, I think you can attest to this, we've been talking about transportation and infrastructure for a very long time. Our president, our Secretary Buttigieg, who sends his regards, we've been talking about Infrastructure Week for almost a number of years. And now, due to the success of the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're now ushering what is in a bipartisan fashion, an infrastructure decade. But one of the things that we're seeing is that, and again, from lived experience, from working with transit workers who are helping frontline workers get and fro from their jobs, when we work with our colleagues in the medical health space, where we're seeing communities that actually have more active transportation, have lower COVID ratings, when we see just the economic performance and fiscal health of communities, transportation sits at the center. And the bipartisan infrastructure law, in many ways, creates a new framework for us to work with states and cities like New York City to do not only the big things, but also make sure that we're getting the little things right. And that's what I believe transportation and our national transportation policy really affords with us as part of this new bipartisan infrastructure law.
Thank you, Christopher. And while we're on that topic, so clearly we are making what could be easily considered historic investments in transportation infrastructure. Obviously, the $550 billion bill that you mentioned. There's also in New York, the city, the state has made some capital allocations. But frankly, I guess the question for either of you is, given the lack of sizable and sustained investments over decades and the infrastructure debt that currently exists, will it be enough? Will it be enough to not just patch the problems, but take us to where we need to be as a city and as a country? What do you think, Tom?
I'll talk to the New York region first, and then let Chris talk to the national perspective. I mean, this is a once in several generations moment. This is a kind of, I take a step back. RPA, we're celebrating our centennial this year. And when we look at these things, we look at them on 25 to 50 year kind of cycles. You know, in our region, we were building mass transit at the beginning of the last century, from 1905 to 1935 or so. We essentially build out a subway system and a transit system. Then we stopped doing it. Then in the middle of the last century, for 25 plus years, we are building a limited access highway system, entirely investing in that. We finally start to bring back the New York City subways from the depths of the 1960s and 1970s. We start to finally get to a state of good repair. And then for the last 20 years, we've been slowly trying to add capacity to the system. The projects have taken too long, they've cost too much, and it's kind of like we're learning to walk again for the first time as an industry, as a city, all of the complexity that's involved in doing that. But what happens, where I think we find ourselves right now, is this extraordinary convergence of opportunity, where at a local level, we've been doing the hard work. The MTA has been doing the work to figure out what it should be spending its money on, what its priorities are, and they had passed just before COVID a few years ago, an historic 5-year capital plan of over $50 billion, identifying everything from upgrading the signals to building the Second Avenue subway second phase and implementing congestion pricing. Meanwhile, though, the Port Authority was doing similar work, looking at the path system at the airports and the infrastructure that it maintains. Even New Jersey Transit, for the first time, has a capital plan and a strategic plan. Now, the feds have come along as really active partners in this through the work that Chris and his wonderful colleagues are there, and really the president, leading at the top. And so there's an opportunity to pull this all together and do this. Kind of, is it enough? Well, we need to, I think the biggest challenge for us to make sure is that we don't miss the ball on this. There's still going to be those of us who are working in the trenches on the projects. No, we don't just kind of wave a magic wand and suddenly we get a tunnel under the Hudson River or anything like that. And so we're working really hard to make sure that the moment doesn't pass us by. And that's what we're very, very focused on. But there is absolutely a convergence at the national level and the regional level that we have to take advantage of.
Christopher, any thoughts on your end?
I totally agree with Tom. I think one of the things when we think about the need, there's a huge backlog, whether you look across all of our core assets, whether it's highway, our transit, our railroad system, you look at our supply chain, the list goes on, is in the tens of trillions of dollars of backlog. However, what we've known this for a long time. And in many ways, we've deferred what needed to be done. But cities like New York City and so many other states have been for decades doing things on their own. And the federal government hasn't been there with them as a true partner. What the bipartisan infrastructure law does now is create this once in a generation moment to say the federal government is now a true partner with many of our states and localities who have been wrestling, as Tom pointed out, wrestling with these challenges in real time. But what is also remarkable is that, yes, this is a down payment of not only fixing the problem, because if we're only focusing on fixing what was broken, then we're going to be still stuck with a 1960 and older infrastructure. We now are trying to put investments so that cities like New York, city like Atlanta, and even smaller towns are fighting for the 21st century. And what has been fascinating, what this bipartisan infrastructure law does, it recognizes that. One of the fascinating aspects of this bill is that we put significant dollars now in broadband infrastructure. One of the things we did last week, we announced a new combined NOFO for mega projects, which we are trying to incentivize a project sponsor to think about. Not only if you're expanding transit or a new highway system, how can we bring broadband into that aspect? Because we know too many kids were sitting in McDonald's parking lot, even in New York City, right? Trying to get reliable internet service to participate in education services, right? So on top of that, we also recognize that we had to do the things that actually make communities have great quality of life. This last year, even in COVID, where we had significant individuals, commuters living at home, teleworking, we still had over 30,000 Americans die or receive serious injuries on our roadways. And I know New York City has been on the forefront of thinking about how can we actually make it easier for people to just get around safely in their neighborhoods. This infrastructure package recognizes those unique quality of life, because what is also fascinating, I go on the road, the secretary goes on the road, and the president goes as well. Yes, everyone knows we need to fix the Second Avenue. We need to build out and replace the Hudson Tunnel. But you know what people also want to know? How will this bill make my life better? And one of the things I always am fascinated by, and this is some of the work that I know Tom's team did for a number of years, transportation not only is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and I know we are all aligned in terms of how we address that, but it's also a silent killer in the household budget. One of the remarkable things we saw is that transportation is the second most expensive expenditure in your household. And when you look at the middle to low income, that is at a higher rate. And so when you ask why and how we think about infrastructure, this is one of the number one issues that we're focused on. And we think we can do a lot more now as a federal partner in partnership with localities and all that. And again, this is a down payment.
That's great, and I want to come back to many of those points because they're dead on. But I do want to go back to something Tom mentioned and I've raised before is, you talked about some of the projects. You talked about this sort of, we've lost the muscle memory or the practice of doing these big builds. They take too long, they cost too much. So I guess the question is, in an era where that's certainly the case, where we don't have the practice, we have worker shortages, we have material shortages and supply chain issues. Is it even feasible to make the kind of progress on this ambitious scale that we all agree is needed? What will it take to actually get the work done? And I look to you first, Christopher.
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think it's also managing expectations, but also recognizing what we can do today and what we need to build for tomorrow. And as such, as one of the things we learned as part of the supply chain, we have to, as a federal partner, have to work much, much closer, not only to our state and local grantee recipients, but also with the private sector. And one of the things we learned is that we need to prepare a new workforce. We need to actually retrain the workforce. One of the things we are excited about as we're rolling this bipartisan infrastructure law is that we are working with some of our sister agencies. For example, the Department of Labor, we have entered into a MOU where we're going to be dedicating and working in partnership dedicated resources to grant recipients and localities to build up their workforce for these infrastructure projects. We're not going to build a bridge in a day, right? These are projects that have to be planned and engineered, and we have to now assemble and work. But it's also not just using the existing pipeline for workforce development, it's also creating new ones, partnering with HBCUs, community groups who are on the front lines and bringing them a part of the ecosystem. I also believe this is an opportunity for us to also think about how we do infrastructure at scale. Tom, you're absolutely right. We have not had that muscle memory for doing big things. But because we now have an infrastructure package that gives a longer runway of certainty, we're going to start being able to work with state DOTs, bringing some of the things we're learning from international standards of like, how do we do cost containment, while at the same time making sure that jobs have prevailing wage and in many cases are free and fair for unions. And so those are opportunities you couldn't do when you're doing ad hoc transportation funding. Now with these long-term investments, we can have these very deliberate and intentional strategies that gets us to a place where 20 years from now, we can look back and say we built the ecosystem that can ensure that we can do big things for years to come.
Yeah. Can I jump on that?
Yes, please. No, I was going to turn to you.
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, look, first off, I'll say just from a parochial perspective, like, you know, the conversations that are being had at the Departments of Transportation and the MTA and the agencies and stuff, they're all concerned about this and they want to get in the front of the line because they want to get that skilled workforce to get, because we know we're going to be in competition with the rest of the country for this. So I think that what Chris is talking about is got to be the right way to look at it. We did an analysis a couple of years ago at RPA at what we called the mega projects, because we did build over the last 20 years between the 7 extension out to Hudson Yards, the first phase of 2nd Avenue Subway, and East Side Access, which is going to open at the end of this year. And I'm curious how many people in this audience are even aware of it, but that I just have to plug. You know, next time you're at Grand Central Terminal, look down at your feet and realize that basically 100 feet below you is a new terminal that has been hewn out of the rock that will open later this year, that will allow people living on Long Island to decide whether they're taking a train to Penn Station or Grand Central, knocking about 15 minutes off their commute every single day, moving the commute shed a little further out east, and affecting all of those work from home issues that we've been talking about. But we looked at those projects and all of them, you know, faced real challenges in terms of budget and timing. And the answer is there's no single answer to this. There's no one piece, there's no silver bullet. Everything from the planning and procurement to the financing to the delivery and everything, we need to be improving all pieces of that. But the flip side of it is that, you know, often in the kind of renewable energy conversation, there's an understanding that what we're going to have to do to decarbonize our energy system is going to lead to jobs and economic growth and prosperity for populations over the next generation. And that's looked at as a great opportunity. And I think that we need to start thinking in the transportation sector the same way, and realizing that what we need to do is start gearing up job training and creating these kinds of channels so that we're delivering the workforce and the expertise, because this isn't going to be a 5-year process. This is going to be generational, and we need to maintain the momentum, and that means we're going to need to develop those portions of the economy.
I guess the question I would, this reminds me, I had a friend in college, this is quite some time ago, who was studying mechanical engineering because he had decided that a lot of our infrastructure had a terminus date and it was coming up soon, so he thought it would be a good investment. I don't think it turned out that way because that was 30 years ago, and we're now talking about infrastructure. So I guess my question is, how do we ensure? So if we're going to invest in this and build that workforce of the future to do this kind of work, how do we ensure that we don't find ourselves in the same place 20, 40, 60 years from now, where we have a long stretch of underinvestment and underdevelopment?
Well, I think how the bipartisan infrastructure law is a testament of what local governments and state governments have been doing for a long time. It's going to require a level of partnership and leadership. We know the problem, but we actually need to have a shared vision of what we need to go. And I think the bipartisan infrastructure law gives us that platform. And that also creates an enormous level of responsibility that I know the president and the Secretary Buttigieg shares and understands, that we have to administer these dollars that says, literally 5 years from now, when we have to come back in front of Congress and to the American taxpayer, that we not only use these resources in a way that address some of those mundane things that we just discussed earlier, but we are actually setting a framework for, and I think there's a bipartisan recognition now as a nation. And I think that's what COVID actually did for us, that it really had a level set to say, look, if we don't invest in ourselves, we won't have a supply chain that can keep us global competitive. If we don't invest ourselves, our frontline workers who are going to those hospitals, right, won't be there to take care of your grandmother, right? If we don't invest in ourselves, how can our kids get to school, right, and successfully? And I think many of the cases, we have a unique opportunity. So as stewards of these resources, we recognize that we have to do it in a way that actually assures that 5 years from now and then 10 years from now, we have a framework that can, again, maintain that shared vision and that buy-in from the taxpayers. And we recognize that.
And how do we do that at the local level, where the work actually gets done? How do we keep this front and center?
Well, I mean, getting out of the boom and bust cycle of capital investments and management of these systems is absolutely something we need to break. And, we kind of created, it was about 100 years ago that, the Port Authority was first created as a kind of self-funding public authority model, and then Robert Moses comes along with the famous clause in the Triborough Bridge Bill and makes it, make sure that the tolls never expire. And we kind of created a model that was supposed to be doing that ongoing investment and maintenance for these systems. And we really got away from that kind of a governance model. So we're going to have to break that cycle on the one hand. Jano Lieber, the head of the MTA, talks about, we all know what's going on here with, ridership is down. We rely on the fare box to pay for almost half of the cost of maintaining the subways and buses. So we're going to need to find new revenue sources and new models for doing that. And that's going to be absolutely necessary. But I'll say on the other side, the other thing that's really interesting is that this is happening at a time when technology and frankly COVID, we've talked a lot this morning about work from home and the effects that COVID has had on that. From the urbanist perspective, there have been a couple other phenomenon that come out of COVID that are equally disruptive with potential benefits and costs to urban communities. The design and use of our streets has completely changed. We had open streets, we had restaurants on the streets, cycling went up, and now suddenly I think the public recognizes that streets are a mutable space and that we ought to be thinking about what the most efficient use of them is. And we're going to be next year actually charging people to drive into Manhattan. So with any hope, the policy will be coming along to capitalize on that. There were some references to e-commerce, but of course we know it's Christmas every single day for Amazon and UPS and FedEx, and that's not going to change. But that's also putting new demands on land use. Warehouse sprawl is now a term that we didn't have 3 years ago. And of course, how these goods get delivered in that instant fashion that we all demand and expect is really putting new demands on the system. All of this means that there are going to be kind of both new stresses on the system and new opportunities to use the technology and address these things that I think hopefully get us out of that cycle that we've had of kind of investment and disinvestment in these systems.
Well, I hope that's the case. But it's interesting that you mentioned that, the warehouse sprawl, and how do we balance the short-term needs and fixes that are so necessary? Clearly bridges that are falling or about to fall, with this long-term planning and really taking into account what the future needs, transportation needs will be, which arguably will not be the same ones that existed 50 years ago or 60 years ago. Christopher, I don't know your thoughts on how best to manage those two competing needs.
Let's be honest, there are a lot of competing needs. And many of which, there's a common term I'm using now, how do you pick amongst your favorite children of sorts? We have a labor challenge, we have an equity challenge, we have a climate challenge, we have an economic challenge, and the list goes on. One of the things that and in terms of the Department of Transportation, what we're trying to do is make sure that we have a fundamental understanding of the decision matrix of the locality, of the state, and our federal needs, the trade-offs that comes with those. But at the heart of it, there is equity. And I think one of the things that this president has put on the forefront is that with these investments, we had to ensure that no community, particularly those that have been on the receiving end of much of our disparities or environmental injustice, are prioritized. And as part of that, we have taken an approach called the Justice 40 Initiative. Of the investments that we are rolling out as part of the $1.2 trillion infrastructure package, those funds that support clean transportation, clean energy, we are prioritizing 40% of the benefit directly to disadvantaged communities. Why? Because we know 20 years from now, those are going to be the same communities that are going to be who have been on the front line, but will continue to be on the front line of climate crisis, of the economic disruptions that we're seeing, as well as the next public health crisis. If we don't do that today, we will not be a country, right, that can continue to do big things. And I think that's what the bipartisan infrastructure law gave us a framework to say we have to not only do big things, but we have to actually take care and prioritize those who've been left behind. The second piece here is one of the things I think has been really remarkable about the implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law is that there are many communities like New York City and many others who have recognized that sometimes if you just have a conversation with your taxpayer or with your neighborhood or key stakeholders, people can understand the trade-offs, but we need to have a conversation. We need to have the partnership. And so to the extent, I'm seeing it every single day through the grants that are coming in and engagement, the communities that are creating those partnerships and shared tables are able to sustain the various disruptions and challenges because they're going at it together. And I think that is something that as a department, we're going to continue to support, try to encourage, and to the greatest extent, encourage other localities to replicate. So I think in many ways, you're always going to have challenges when you have a $1 trillion or so backlog of needs. But what has been missing, and I think I'm seeing in a lot of communities, is that we're going to make those decisions together, not in a closed room where decisions have been made despite of another neighborhood or community.
If I can just underscore, just from our side of the table, how dramatic the change that Chris is talking about is, it really is kind of a new, it's not just that there are resources coming now from Congress, but that there's leadership within the administration. I'm not going to say it's only because of the New Yorkers like Polly Trottenberg and Veronica Vanderpool, who are his colleagues there. But just a contributing factor, I'm sure. But it is actually, I mean, honestly, kind of, I look at a team and I think this is a group that is actually putting out a message, and a consistent one, to try and do things in a different way. And I think that that's really important. But if I can, I'm going to rephrase your question.
Please.
In a slightly more to my advantage. Because you know, when you talk about the short versus the long term, what the question I'm often getting these days is, okay, in a post-COVID world with ridership down, do we still need a tunnel under the Hudson River? Do we still need expansion of the subway system or anything like that? And you know, and all the debate that we've had about work from home and feeds into all of that, what will be happening. And you know, I come out with an emphatic yes on these things. And in particular, I think, at least from the New York region, to understand where we were, you know, 2 years and 2 months ago. We were at the situation, we were at the end of a decade where New York City had added 1 million new jobs. Economic growth in the tri-state metropolitan region, at RPA, we look at the entire region. From 1975 to 2000, roughly, for every 10 jobs created in that region, 1 of them was in New York and 9 of them were outside the city. It was it was a suburban economy, and I grew up in that, and that's what we all kind of, I think many of us kind of thought that that was just the way the world would always go. And then around 2000, something shifted, and not only did New York City suddenly start to gain, you know, its share of the growth, but the lion's share, and for some of that period, it was almost 90% of the new job growth was within the city. We all saw what that meant in terms of, you know, increasing rents and office occupancy and crowded subways, the summer of hell on the subways and things like that. But the thing was, that wasn't a sustainable level of growth. And so at RPA, when we were projecting out what would happen over 25 years or so, we were failing to meet the demand that we had. When we kind of looked at models about economic growth that were unconstrained and then figured out what we thought we would have, we were going to fail both in the housing market and in the infrastructure system. We were going to fail miserably to deliver the kinds of capacity that we needed to sustain equitable prosperity and growth in the region. Then COVID hits. Suddenly we go down to, it's a near-death experience kind of for transit ridership. Now it's coming back up. But the way we think of it is, it's just bought us a window of time, frankly, to try and catch up to all the targets that we were completely missing 3 years ago. And so on a short-term basis, I still think of it as we need to move ahead for those pieces. And when we look out long-term, I will admit also I have a problem, like every time Ed Glazer gives one of those talks and kind of shows New York ranking very, very poorly on all of his indices, it's hard for me. And I know he's right with all of the empirical data, but the fact is that New York, because it is so huge, even a low percentage of growth and ranking against those still means that we need millions of square feet of new commercial office space, and that the growth, that the number of people and jobs that are coming are still pretty amazing. And so we're going to need that level of sustained investment in our systems, in our housing, in our transportation network, even in our commercial districts, to make sure that we don't find ourselves bumping up against the limits of capacity the way we were 3 years ago before COVID hit.
Surely, but that does raise a question, because you alluded to this earlier, and we did spend the morning talking about working from home and all of the different projections of what that could imply. So if we look at the implications for transportation, if office workers, those that I think Jesse called remotable jobs, spend less time, I think one of the calculuses was 30%, fine. Clearly that's going to impact revenue. Right, this is 30% of the workers, but 50% of the pay. Again, that's information that was shared this morning by Nick. So the fact that the MTA is funded by by revenue from shares, what does that mean? Does that mean reduced service? How does that impact these investments at a time when I agree there needs to be this growth, but ridership will be down. And that could force some difficult decision. And that, going back to the equity point, puts those frontline workers who can't work from home in a bind if there is reduced service. So how do we think about that so we don't fall into that trap? Or does the funding model just make that happen?
So I'll answer from my perspective, and then Chris can give the big picture. I mean, all of those challenges are absolutely real. The federal funding allowed us to maintain operations for the near term and not raise fares too much and other things. But we know that the federal government, it'll be the gift that stops giving, kind of. So we have to be ready for that future. And even on top of, the nuances are very important in this too. Now, work trips are declining as people work from home, but of course work trips are only a minority of overall travel. And so one of the things that's happened is we've started to see discretionary travel increasing. And if at the MTA, you might look at the top line numbers and see a 15-20% reduction in travel, but actually in the off-peak and the weekends, travel is, I think, basically back up to where it was pre-COVID. And so the behavior patterns are gonna shift in a lot of ways, but some of that will also be difficult. I mean, I think in particular, so much of the conversation about work from home is making it attractive and attracting people back to the office. And if they're not just working 9 to 5 anymore, they're going to expect what used to be a kind of acceptable level of service on the Long Island Railroad at 1 p.m. on a Wednesday is no longer acceptable, because some of those people coming in are going to be expecting to leave or come in later or earlier and are going to want a higher level of service. So all of that is going to be putting enormous stress on the system. I mean, I think the answers are fairly obvious. Looking for alternative revenue sources and trying to figure out how to get as much efficiency out of the system as we can. And a big part of the capital investments that are on the table right now are ways to make the system more efficient. Moving to communications-based train control in the New York City subway allows you to have fewer people operating and running those trains. And so those are the kinds of trade-offs that we're going to have to look for over time to try and bring this back into balance.
Christopher, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
Oh, absolutely. There are 3 points here. First, transit is more than commuters. So we have to get our mindset out of what transit is supposed to serve. Transit is by means of getting people to move easier through the built environment And if we can figure out a way to make money off it, we will through economic development. And that's one of the things that we're seeing a lot of transit agencies are beginning to think about. If we have, a lot of our suburban counterparts coming into the downtown using transit, and if our revenue models have been based on that, with that level of reduction, what do we do? And a lot of this is not just a story of MTA. This is a story of many transit agents across the country. And what we're finding, and it's actually fascinating, because the great work that Tom's team did when they did the Wake Up Walk Up really gave it's interesting. It was 4 years prior to the COVID, but it gave a hint of where the market wants to go. We all understand Manhattan being a regionally significant or even a global significant walkable urban place. But where we see the market really going is the urbanization of suburbs. And if you look finer, it's like, where is your home and where are the amenities around it? And actually, if you in the DC market and some of the major markets, in the residential neighborhoods that had easy access to hospitals, to grocery stores, to outdoor parks, their price premiums could not be registered. But when you compare those to your drivable suburban locations, that individual had to get in the car and go to medical, to go to the grocery store, those prices dropped. And while in some places came up, but did not see the same level of appreciation. But suburban locations where they actually for many years, begin to retrofit themselves from a more auto-centric to more walking, biking, easy access to trails, they were going through the roof.
Absolutely.
And so fundamentally, transit agencies are saying we have these suburban assets that we thought were just basically park and ride, get them to the urban core. Now they're new value add to our systems. So as a department, we are sitting here saying, well, we now, as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, we can do something that transit agencies couldn't do before. We now can bring transportation and land use as a new value capture opportunity for transit agencies. One of our loan programs called TIFIA now allows us to give long-term financing to transit agencies who are interested in doing joint development deals with developers who in the past would say, for us to take those suburban locations and retrofit them, we need a longer financing window. We now can give a 30-year window. That is unheard of. And on top of that, Congress also now gave us, through our railroad loan program called RIF, the ability to do commercial residential amongst our passenger rail lines across the country, which is going to be a huge opportunity for transit agencies and passenger rail providers to rethink their assets of how they can create new value add opportunities for their revenue. At the same time, meeting our housing needs, particularly for affordable housing, but also creating new opportunities for us to absorb growth in the urban core.
Can I just jump
no, this
on
is
that?
a big
You could see
topic
me
for
like,
you. Yes, no, absolutely.
Because it's such an important dynamic, and I have to say one of the things this morning, kind of in the talk about work from home, it's almost like if a worker isn't going into the office, they're like slipping into the fifth dimension and disappearing. When in fact, what they're doing is they're staying in a local community. And it's those kinds of communities that Chris is talking about. And are they in a community where there's a walkable downtown, and what the planners look at, the cappuccino coefficient? Is there a kind of high cappuccino coefficient of activities and things that they're going to be supporting a local economy for, as opposed to the downtown one? And so some of their economic activity, it hasn't disappeared, it has simply shifted, kind of rebalanced across the metropolitan region in a way that actually has a lot of benefits and gains for those communities. But this is where the policy is really missing the boat. And and Kathy talked about the ADU legislation in Connecticut. There's been arguments about this too. I mean, the simple fact is, Long Island has gotten, between East Side Access, the third track, Moynihan Train Hall, and renovation of Penn Station, we're talking about close to $20 billion of public funding, of federal and state funding, to improve the commuting experience on Long Island. But the communities out there are not allowing for the kind of development that Chris is talking about, the multifamily rental mixed-use kind of development around them. And we don't right now have a mechanism. And when the governor in her budget talked about trying to change that through accessory dwelling units and transit-oriented development, making some of that as of right, you would have thought that she had, tried to overturn Western civilization completely. And somehow home rule has become the kind of, the policy, the bipartisan policy that everybody's supporting. And I'm challenged to find a worse policy legacy than home rule in terms of delivering what we need as a society in terms of housing and social equity and climate and other things. And yet this fight is one that we're losing right now, and we've got to overtake and it ties in with all of these investments and what we're trying to do right now.
Yeah, I mean, we all know that transportation is key to economic development, and that includes individuals and households, and especially for those that are underserved. The lack of access is a gross impediment. So I think we're out of time, but I know we started a little bit late, so I'm gonna just give each panelist one last softball question. Is there a specific project that you feel will have the greatest impact on the city? Of all of those that you've mentioned, is there something that is particularly going to solve all of my commuting problems?
Chris, you want to go first?
Oh, no. So I'm gonna let you go first.
Picking among our children. Look, I would say two things. One, next year, God willing, New York City will have congestion pricing. And that's more than just kind of charging people to drive in. Mm-hmm. It's starting to rebalance that relationship between transit and driving. It's starting to put market considerations into what's happening. And right now, we couldn't have a worse system than the one we have right now, where we have a half dozen different tolling authorities running policies in direct contradiction to each other. I mean, I'll just as one snippet, I was on the mayor's BQE task force to try and figure out what to do with that Moses-era highway that's falling down. And we looked at it at RPA, and we estimated that 25% of the single occupancy vehicles on the BQE in a typical morning are people starting in South Brooklyn trying to get to places in Manhattan, and the most direct route for them is called the Hugh Carey Tunnel, the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. But they drive out of their way across the BQE because the Brooklyn Bridge is free. And so we pay them essentially to drive further, worsening air quality, worsening traffic congestion, all of those things. We pay them to do it, and then we're surprised that they do it. So we have to rationalize the tolling system in our region, and congestion pricing is an opportunity to do it. But I'm also nervous about it, and I'll just say that the bill itself says that the MTA will have the ability to charge people to drive into and remain in the district. And the MTA's lawyers have concluded that that means that they can only charge in one direction when people come in. So there won't be a charge to leave. And of course, what we want is a differential between the peak and off-peak, and we like to incentivize people not to leave during the peak. And that will not be part of that policy as things stand right now. So we have a lot of work to do to try and improve that and get that going. I can't though, without saying the Gateway, building the tunnel under the Hudson River is absolutely essential. It's not just about bringing another, say, 100,000 New Jersey commuters, but it's really about making sure that New York still has access to the population, to the growing workforce. And in particular, because Long Island and Connecticut and Westchester are really, because there's so many limits on housing development in those parts of the region, if New York is going to continue to grow and survive, it's going to need to have access to commuters from New Jersey.
Terrific. Christopher, I don't know if you have any last words. I know we're up on time, but.
Listen, I will just say, this administration has made significant commitments. Just recently, in our FY23 budget, we highlighted the Second Avenue. Our secretary and our president has made the Hudson Project a priority for this administration. I think you guys know very well that we as an administration are very much committed to addressing some of the significant challenges that the New York City and broader region are facing. But I will just take a moment to say that while we have to build the cathedrals that will be around and we can point to for the next 100 years, I would tell you the thing that I am excited about and will be a testament of whether or not this administration and future administrations, if we have done this right, is what I experienced when I was a student at St. John's living in Brooklyn, when I used to take the B 40, 42 to the 2 and 5 to Manhattan, to then take the E to get to Kew Gardens, to take the Q46 down Union Turnpike to get to St. John's campus, 2 hours. We can get commuters in much quicker than that, but if a resident who traveled from South Georgia to attend school in New York City, it took him 2 hours to get to school. If we can cut that to half, then that assures that New York City will be the global capital for its century because talent will continue to come. That is the experience. That's the cathedral that New York City and many other communities across the country are fighting for. How do we create a community, a town, a state, and a nation that attracts talent that wants to stay and do it efficiently? That's my cathedral that we should all build together.
Terrific. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Christopher.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you all. That was a great conversation. More to come.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you.
It was fun.